In the winter of 2008, buried deep beneath the unforgiving terrain of eastern Afghanistan, a U.S. recon operative was declared dead. His name was redacted from every report, his body never recovered, and his death was filed as unrecoverable due to geological instability. For years, the military maintained that he was killed instantly during a tunnel collapse, and no further rescue was authorized. But that wasn't the truth. Unknown to his command and the world, he was still alive, trapped under 5 feet of fractured rock, twisted metal, and frozen debris. His leg was crushed, his lungs filled with dust, and his radio was destroyed. He had no light, no food, no water, and no way to signal for help. Except against all logic, he found one. With a broken transmitter, a stripped piece of copper wire, and fragments of gear salvaged from the wreckage, he reassembled a shortwave signal and broadcast a message on a forgotten frequency, a channel no longer monitored by standard military operations. That signal traveled through stone, static, and silence. And then, by pure chance, it was intercepted. What followed was a classified chain of events that defied protocol, risked multiple careers, and resulted in a rescue no one ever admitted happened. This story was never supposed to be told. The soldier's name remains hidden. His voice was recorded only once. And to this day, the frequency he used remains active, just in case someone else ever finds themselves buried where no one is supposed to survive. The operation had been authorized under a low-visibility directive known only to a limited circle within Joint Special Operations Command. The region in question, a mountainous corridor northeast of coast, had long been considered geologically unstable and strategically irrelevant, until intelligence intercepts picked up encrypted radio signals bouncing through frequencies last used in the 1980s. Satellite imagery revealed heat signatures near what appeared to be the remnants of a Soviet-era tunnel system, long buried under landslides and forgotten in official maps. There were no confirmed enemy sightings, no signs of heavy transport, and no traditional insurgent movement. But the patterns were irregular, consistent, and localized. Something was moving under the rock. The team selected for insertion was comprised of 6 Tier 1 operators, drawn from a composite task force specializing in subterranean reconnaissance and hostile environment survival. They trained for months in simulated conditions mimicking tunnel collapse, electromagnetic interference, and total light deprivation. Their objective was precise: infiltrate the suspected Soviet tunnel grid, assess structural integrity, confirm or disprove enemy presence, plant seismic beacons, and exfil without triggering contact or exposure. They would be invisible to both locals and allies. No uniforms, no unit patches. Their insertion would take place by night under a blackout sky, with air support hovering out of range to avoid acoustic detection. Insertion occurred at 0312 local time. The team deployed via low-altitude parachute drop into a narrow basin approximately 4 kilometers from the suspected tunnel entrance. Winds were harsh and visibility minimal. Each operator carried customized lightweight gear. No full rucks, only modular packs with tools, rations, signal beacons, breaching kits, shortwave encrypted comms, and minimal weaponry. The directive emphasized speed and silence over firepower. Within 20 minutes of landing, the team advanced northeast along a dry riverbed obscured by fog and loose gravel. The cold was severe, cutting through layered uniforms and numbing fingers through gloves. By 0450, the team had reached the staging point, a collapsed ridgeline concealing the tunnel mouth beneath fractured shale and dormant snowdrifts. Using thermal scanning and fiber optics, the team located the tunnel entrance partially buried beneath debris. It was exactly where Cold War-era topographic overlays suggested it would be, though the shape of the opening, the edges of reinforced steel, and the subtle presence of oxidation indicated that it had been opened recently. Not by weather, but by tools. Someone had been there before them. The interior temperature registered several degrees higher than the surrounding Earth, despite the freezing surface conditions. As the team breached the entrance, their forward scout noted scratch marks along the interior steel framing. No footprints, no dust. The tunnel had been cleared, not just passable, cleaned. As they descended into the tunnel, the air became still, metallic, heavy with the scent of stale concrete and oxidized rebar. Their footsteps echoed sharply, too sharply. Ambient noise was non-existent, devoured by thick, curved walls designed for seismic insulation. Every 10 meters, they marked structural nodes with chalk and planted wireless seismic pingers to record subterranean pressure changes. Lighting was kept to infrared low beam. Headlamps remained off. They moved in a staggered column, communicating via silent hand signs and coded vibration pulses on wrist-mounted receivers. Despite no visible signs of movement, their instincts were on edge. The deeper they moved, the more the air seemed to close around them. Some segments of the tunnel bore scorch marks. Others showed signs of intentional collapse, not from age, but from controlled charges. This place wasn't abandoned. It had been restructured. By 0537, they had advanced nearly 300 meters into the shaft. At this depth, traditional radio contact was impossible. Their relay drone positioned above the ridge transmitted no pings, expected in such conditions. That's when they entered the chamber. It was larger than anticipated, roughly 9 meters across with a collapsed ceiling forming jagged stalactites of broken cement and corroded pipes. At the center was a small ventilation shaft, vertical and dark, perhaps 30 feet tall. Scattered around the chamber were signs of recent presence. A shredded water packet, a single boot print partially frozen in thawed gravel, a cracked flashlight casing with Cyrillic markings still legible. The team fanned out. Sensors registered no movement, but the tension was growing. One of the operators paused at the chamber's far wall, where a support beam protruded at an unnatural angle, revealing something not listed in any Soviet engineering manual. A secondary shaft branching left at a steep downward angle, recently cleared, and reinforced with modern materials. The lead operator signaled a halt. The angle of the tunnel, the fresh reinforcement, and the way light refused to penetrate more than a meter inside. It didn't add up. The geometry of the shaft was wrong. It had been repurposed. Before they could confirm next steps, the floor beneath the second man clicked. A vibration, low and resonant, pulsed through the structure like the growl of a buried beast. It wasn't a tremor. It was a switch. The last thing the operator in the rear saw was dust rising from the tunnel's ceiling, followed by a thunderous roar that swallowed their formation whole. The blast was not instantaneous. It began with a sound, a low metallic groan that vibrated through the soles of their boots before their ears caught up. A half-second after the floor panel clicked, a controlled detonation sequence surged from beneath the structural supports, sending a shockwave spiraling through the reinforced concrete, like a bone snapping from the inside out. The chamber that once felt like a sealed tomb suddenly erupted with pressure, dust, and the sound of the earth folding inward. The tunnel ceiling collapsed in calculated intervals, each charge timed to fall in succession from front to rear, sealing escape routes and crushing anything beneath. Chunks of concrete, steel mesh, and rusted piping fell in waves. The chamber lights failed. One man was decapitated instantly by a horizontal shard of rebar, another pinned under a cascade of fragmented stone. Screams never fully formed, drowned by the collapse. In under 6 seconds, the entire team was erased from view. The operator positioned near the far wall, the one closest to the unknown shaft, vanished first. A falling beam struck the upper section of his helmet, snapping his neck sideways with the force of a wrecking ball. The man behind him was swallowed whole by a sudden fissure opening under his feet, likely a tunnel cavity reactivated by the explosion. The remaining soldiers attempted to retreat toward the entrance, but they were too deep, and the pressure front moving through the tunnel was stronger than any human body could resist. Those at the back were thrown off their feet by the air blast alone, slamming into walls, their gear ripped from their frames by the concussive force. Backpacks, carbines, and radios tumbled into dust. The temperature inside the chamber surged upward, likely from chemical accelerants used in the charges. By the time the dust began to settle, only 2 operators were left semi-conscious, buried under fragmented metal scaffolding near the original hatch. Both had concussions. One had a collapsed lung. Their exfil plan was gone, their comms were inoperable, and their last known coordinates were already buried beneath 20 tons of rubble. Above ground, the seismic ripple was picked up by NATO surveillance satellites within 2 minutes. Initially, it was categorized as a minor tectonic shift, but the timing matched the last signal ping from the recon team's field beacon. A backup drone sweep recorded thermal anomalies and airborne particulates, consistent with a controlled underground detonation. Command was notified. Recovery assets were scrambled but placed on hold within minutes. Satellite imaging showed ongoing Earth shifts, making ground insertion for rescue too dangerous. An official risk assessment was issued, declaring the site compromised. Orders came down to freeze operations until further analysis. Within the hour, the mission was reclassified. The 2 surviving operators were extracted by nightfall after crawling their way back to the extraction ridge. Their injuries were extensive. They were debriefed under sedation and classified lockdown. They had no memory of how the blast was triggered, what they couldn't explain, And what no one in command could answer was what happened to the sixth man. He hadn't been seen since the detonation. His biometric tracker stopped transmitting instantly. His name was redacted from the final report, marked as remains unrecoverable, presumed dead. No one had time to grieve. No body, no blood trail, just a digital termination in the system and a closed file. Beneath the mountain, however, the sixth man was still alive. The blast had thrown him sideways into the secondary shaft, a section previously thought sealed and uncharted. The collapse didn't crush him outright, but instead buried him in a coffin of stone, steel, and darkness. A rusted pipe caved in across his thigh, pinning him at an angle. His helmet had been torn off in the fall, and blood pooled into the gravel beneath him. He was barely breathing. Dust filled his mouth, his nostrils, his lungs. One of his arms was wedged beneath his body, dislocated. The other, scraped and trembling, lay across a mound of twisted debris. His comms unit sparked beside him, cracked open, barely intact. The beam that pinned him cut through his lower body. Moving was impossible. Screaming was pointless. The silence was total, broken only by the creak of settling metal and the low hiss of fractured air pipes. Above, the tunnel had sealed itself like a wound. No light penetrated. No air moved. The pressure was crushing, both physical and psychological. Hours passed. The cold deepened. The man's breathing slowed, but consciousness did not leave him. Pain, blinding and relentless, kept his mind tethered to reality. He focused on it. Used it. Inventory assessments ran in his head in a loop. Water supply, 0. Medical kits, destroyed. Ammunition, unusable. Oxygen, unknown. Radio, damaged, but still sparking. He began pulling pieces toward him with his free hand. The wire from a snapped headset, the transmitter coil, a backup lithium cell from a shattered GPS module. With no light to see and only muscle memory from training, he began assembling. His instructors had always said knowledge was the last weapon. He never thought it would apply like this. His first transmission was a whisper. He pressed the patchwork transmitter to his chest and hissed static into the dark. No response. He repeated the same phrase every 5 minutes. Buried alive, still breathing, request extraction. He repeated it in every code he could remember. Then he began sending pulse tones in case anyone monitoring forgotten frequencies could trace them. There was no feedback. But he continued anyway. The pain would eventually overwhelm his body. The air would eventually run out. But he knew as long as he could transmit, even into the void, he wasn't dead. Not yet. And somewhere beyond the collapsed stone, far above the sealed shaft, the signal began to drift upward into the cold, thin air of the Afghan mountains. Weak. Broken. But real. At some point, he lost track of time. Minutes became hours. Hours dissolved into something else entirely. Something untethered to the movement of the sun or the logic of clocks. There was no light to mark the passage of time. No rhythm beyond the shallow pulse in his neck and the sharp stab of pain radiating from his pinned leg every time he dared to shift his weight. The only consistent sensation was pressure. The earth was pressing in on him from all sides, like the slow closing of a stone fist. The air was stale, tainted with fine dust that coated his throat and stung his eyes. Every breath felt like inhaling sandpaper, and every cough sent bolts of pain through his ribs. He knew one was cracked, maybe two. His lips were splitting, drying fast in the subterranean cold, and his body was starting to shake in short, involuntary bursts as shock settled in deeper. He cataloged everything he had, counting it silently again and again like a ritual meant to keep his sanity tethered to reality. One damaged transmitter housing, one stripped copper wire, half of a lithium battery he'd extracted from a cracked GPS tracker, a broken antenna rod, and a section of his helmet's frame, which he had used as a crude grounding contact. His flashlight was shattered, offering no visibility, but he remembered the layout of his gear by touch. Every item became a lifeline. With one arm still pinned useless beneath his torso and the other barely functional, he began assembling the makeshift transmitter entirely by feel. He twisted wires with blood-slicked fingers, stripped insulation with his teeth, and held components in place using parts of his uniform. The process was agonizingly slow, interrupted by waves of nausea, micro-blackouts, and the encroaching fog of hypoxia. But he forced himself to continue, working in absolute silence, guided only by the faintest hope that someone might still be listening on the other side of the rock. His training had always emphasized improvisation, adaptation, and mental control under extreme duress. But none of the scenarios had prepared him for this. Total isolation, physical paralysis, and a steadily decreasing oxygen level inside what was essentially a subterranean tomb. He monitored his breath as best he could, taking in shallow draws through the side of his mouth to conserve air. The tight space around his chest made deeper breathing impossible. A few times he began to hyperventilate, panic setting in with the realization that there was no margin for error, no backup plan, no extraction team mobilizing above him. He was alone, completely alone. The outside world had already written him off as dead, and if he didn't keep his mind active, if he let go of even one thread of clarity, he knew the darkness would consume him fully. Not just the physical dark, but the one that lives inside the human mind when it's pushed past all points of reference. Somewhere between his 6th and 10th signal attempt, he began hallucinating. Shapes floated in the void behind his closed eyelids. He saw outlines of people he hadn't thought of in years. He heard the clicking of boots against tile floors, felt the warmth of kitchen light, and smelled dust burning off old radiators. None of it was real. He knew that. But still, it played in loops inside his head, like some desperate part of his brain was trying to project comfort where there was none. When the pain surged too high, he bit the inside of his cheek until blood filled his mouth. The taste grounded him. It reminded him he was still real, still here. He tapped on the transmitter, sending a pulse tone in irregular bursts. The signal was likely too weak, he knew that. There were mountains above him, tons of earth, no amplification. But he kept trying. The transmission became his heartbeat, a rhythm he could follow, one he could control. It was the only thing he could control. He began clawing at the debris around him. Not to escape, but to create space, to shift airflow, to feel like he was doing something other than waiting to suffocate. With jagged fingernails and fingertips already shredded, he scraped at gravel and broken cement, moving pebbles and dust an inch at a time. Every movement sent fresh pain through his spine and down his immobilized leg. But pain meant sensation, and sensation meant life. At one point, he discovered a small crack in the wall beside him. He pressed his face against it, breathing in the faintest draft of cold air. It was coming from somewhere. That crack became his second lifeline. He redirected his body toward it as best he could, re-angled the transmitter, and began broadcasting again. The phrase didn't change. Buried alive. Still breathing. Need help. The words repeated in a mechanical rhythm, no longer as a message to others, but as a mantra to himself. It was a denial of death, a refusal to vanish in silence. Every few cycles, he stopped to listen, not just with his ears, but with every sense. He strained to hear even the faintest reply, the barest suggestion that the void was not absolute. Nothing came. But he transmitted anyway. Because transmitting meant hope. Even when it felt like madness. Even when his vision blurred and his muscles trembled from cold and stress. Even when his thoughts became fragmented, his mind drifting between lucidity and delusion. At one point, he thought he heard music. At another, he was sure he felt rain on his face. None of it was real, but the transmitter was. The broken pieces in his hand were real, and so he kept them alive. His body began to betray him. The cold crept deeper. The shivering stopped, replaced by a numb stillness that reached his core. His pulse slowed. His breath came less frequently. He could feel his chest rising and falling like a distant memory. His pinned leg had gone completely numb hours ago, and he knew infection would follow if he made it out. But his hand still moved. He still transmitted. He still believed, irrationally, absolutely, that someone was out there listening, and that was enough to keep him breathing. For now. Somewhere in the freezing dark between hallucination and consciousness, he felt a pulse. It wasn't in his body. It wasn't from the pain, which had dulled to a background hum long ago. It came through the transmitter. Faint. A tiny click in the static. Then silence. Then another, slightly clearer, almost rhythmic. His numb fingers twitched. He strained his ears, holding his breath until the blood roaring in his head faded enough to listen. The sound returned. It was faint, but undeniable. A return signal. No voice, no language. Just a deliberate burst. Static interrupted by human intent. Something had reached him, or someone. For a second he doubted himself. Was it real? or another hallucination masquerading as hope. But the signal repeated at regular intervals, and instinct told him this was no figment. Something had found his transmission. He clamped the rig tighter to his chest, shielding the fragile circuit from debris, and tried to respond. His voice was raw, the vocal cords torn from dry air and days without water. He forced out 3 words. Still here, repeat. Then again. Then in a loop. He didn't expect clarity. He didn't even know if his input reached the surface. But something had changed. He no longer spoke into a void. Somewhere beyond the miles of broken rock above, his pulse had bounced off human attention. That alone altered everything. He began to work again as best he could. The air was colder now, heavier. Either oxygen was thinning or his body was entering late-stage shock, but his focus sharpened. He reorganized the transmitter in increments, bracing it against a dislodged stone to stabilize the frame. Using the torn wire from his helmet mount, he twisted a tighter coil, angling it toward the air draft he had detected earlier. His fingers, cracked and bloodless, barely held tension, but the habit of repetition made the motion automatic. Every detail mattered now. Every connection could amplify the signal. Every adjustment might be the difference between a trace and a ghost. He began tapping in code as well. Rudimentary sequences, short long bursts, numbers, identifiers, anything recognizable as a pattern. The response remained faint, but it held rhythm. He recognized the shift in tone. It was being repeated by equipment, not just bouncing naturally. A relay of some kind was involved. Perhaps a drone. Perhaps a manual signal from a ground post reactivated to scan dead zones. The military had once maintained listening stations for underground comms, dormant since the Cold War. Maybe one was still operational. Maybe some technician, working graveyard shift in a forgotten bunker, had caught a flicker of anomaly and decided to listen instead of ignore. The hallucinations came less frequently now, or rather, they were replaced by memories. Clear, structured, oddly linear. He remembered a training session in Fort Bragg, where he had been forced to navigate a collapsed tunnel simulation with zero visibility and a broken ankle. He recalled how his instructor screamed that time meant nothing underground unless you forced it to obey. He clung to that thought. Time was now an act of will. He set internal timers based on breath counts, even if the intervals weren't real. 10 breaths per transmission cycle. Wait 15. Transmit again. If nothing returned in 10 cycles, switch modulation. It gave his mind a structure, and structure held back despair. Outside, he imagined a chain reaction. The return signal meant someone had received enough data to triangulate. If they were listening, they could now locate him through seismic resonance, even in partial bursts. He remembered a theory from training, that irregular signal loops could be read like echolocation, bouncing inside the stone like sonar. If his pings were consistent, their origin could be traced. He tapped again, this time shifting the coil to emphasize vibration. He struck the wall once, twice, sent a triple burst, then silence, then another triple, repeat. The process drained him, but each repetition was a declaration. He was not gone. He was not silent. The debris shifted at some point. A subtle movement above, perhaps a stone dislodged or pressure redistributed. He didn't know if it was part of a rescue effort or just the mountain resettling, but it sent gravel sliding down into his chest. He didn't move. He only listened. Then he tapped again. Same sequence. Every nerve in his body was screaming. His kidneys ached. His vision pulsed. He couldn't feel his legs anymore, and his left arm had stopped responding. But his right hand still moved. It didn't move with strength, only with purpose. He thought of the men he'd trained with, those who had died in tunnels like this with no name, no signal, no sound. He remembered how many had been buried under orders that forbade retrieval. He swore not to become one of them. If he died, it would not be in silence. It would not be anonymous. Another click, this time louder, followed by a faint frequency sweep. A scan. That was confirmation. Someone was looking for him directly, not passively. His heart, slow and uneven, thudded against his ribs. He tapped one final burst, then another, then passed out. When he awoke again, the world felt colder, but not dead. There was movement in the air, not wind, vibration. He felt it through his chest where his body touched the stone. A distant thrum. Machinery. Somewhere, something was digging. Or at least, probing the rock. It was the first sound not made by him in days. He blinked into the darkness and pulled the transmitter against his chest once more. He whispered. Then he waited. He could afford to wait now. The mountain wasn't silent anymore. The vibration in the rock was real. It wasn't a hallucination or a trick of exhaustion. It had a rhythm, a faint mechanical cadence that resonated through the stone with subtle precision. It came in pulses, never chaotic, never random. He pressed his cheek against the cold rubble and felt it more clearly. Something was approaching from above. He could sense it in his bones. The signal he had transmitted wasn't just received, it had triggered a response. Somewhere far above, a team was moving. They had found him, or at least found where he might be. The thuds were too distant to identify as tools or machinery, but they were organized, deliberate. He didn't know how many hours had passed since the first contact, but time no longer mattered. What mattered was that the void had finally replied. His body was failing. The cold had sunk deep into his core, slowing his pulse and numbing his extremities into uselessness. His right hand, the last part of his body that still functioned with any reliability, now trembled uncontrollably. He held the transmitter tightly to his chest, though he doubted it still worked. Its light had gone out, the circuits sparking intermittently. He had continued tapping long after the signal faded, unwilling to accept that it might be over. But now, for the first time, he allowed himself to stop. Not because he had surrendered, but because something was moving toward him, and he needed to conserve whatever remained of his strength. His lips were cracked and bleeding. His breath came in short, shallow gasps. A sharp pain flared behind his eyes every time he inhaled too quickly. His muscles twitched involuntarily, warning signs that his organs were approaching collapse, but he was still conscious, still here. The mountain groaned as a small section of rubble shifted above him. A fine spray of dust rained down onto his face, and then a muffled sound broke the stillness, metal striking stone. It echoed strangely, muffled through layers of rock, but it was undeniably human. Not the random movement of settling debris, not an aftershock. This was controlled. A second impact followed, then a third, then silence. Then more vibration, this time heavier, like movement from boots planted carefully on loose gravel. The sound disappeared, replaced by a long pause, and then came again. Closer. Methodical. He reached out with numb fingers and knocked 3 times on the steel fragment beside him. The act took nearly all the strength he had left. No response came, but he repeated it anyway. He knocked 3 more times, then stopped. Somewhere in the distance, deep in the layers above him, a sound returned. It was faint. 2 knocks, then 3, then silence. He couldn't believe it at first. His mind tried to explain it away, label it as delusion or echo, but it came again. And again. The pattern repeated. He wasn't hallucinating. Someone was answering. Rescue had begun. They had found him, or at least found the edge of his tomb. Above ground, the extraction team had operated under complete blackout. Their mission was off-book, driven not by command protocol, but by a chain of signals detected on an old Cold War frequency. A technician had recognized the burst pattern and elevated it quietly. From there, an unofficial decision was made. Engineers analyzed seismic feedback and matched it with the origin point of the recon unit's last known position. A narrow signal bleed, amplified by ground-penetrating radar, pinpointed an anomaly, an unnatural chamber, 28 meters beneath the collapsed shaft. It took them 16 hours to mobilize. The digging began with portable seismic bracers, short-blast microcharges, and manual excavation tools. Heavy equipment was ruled out due to the instability of the surrounding rock. The team moved silently and methodically, carving their way through the debris, checking pressure sensors every meter to avoid secondary collapse. Inside the tunnel, he drifted in and out of awareness. Pain faded to background noise. His world narrowed to one sound, the knocks. When they came, he responded weakly, barely tapping. He lost track of how many hours passed between each exchange. His breathing had become ragged. He was aware, distantly, that his organs were beginning to shut down. His right leg no longer registered any sensation. His vision blurred into darkness, but he clung to the pattern, the rhythm of life tapping against the grave. And then, for a moment, he heard something else. A voice. Faint. Filtered through rock, but real. A distorted echo followed by the high-pitched whine of cutting tools. He tried to speak but only coughed. The dust had turned his throat raw, filled his lungs with grit. He could only lie still, blinking slowly, and wait. The final breach came suddenly. A thin beam of light pierced the wall in front of him, too bright to process. His pupils contracted sharply. Shapes moved in the light. Then gloved hands. Then air, rushing cold and clean into the chamber. He felt it on his face, and thought for a moment he had died. Then a hand touched his shoulder, and he realized it was real. They reached him with barely minutes to spare. His body temperature had dropped to critical. His blood oxygen was near terminal levels. His heartbeat was erratic, and his injuries were extensive. Compound fractures, internal bleeding, severe dehydration, and the early stages of organ failure. They carried him out strapped to a collapsible stretcher, navigating back through the narrow extraction shaft they had carved. Every movement threatened another cave-in. Every breath they heard from him was a victory. He was airlifted by medevac 40 minutes later. A forward operating surgical team stabilized his vitals during flight. It took 32 bags of fluid, 4 units of blood, and multiple rounds of defibrillation to keep him alive. He survived. The recovery was long, brutal, and largely classified. His name never appeared in the news. His record was sealed under operational secrecy. The transmitter he had built by hand was recovered in the rubble beside him, partially melted but intact. It was boxed and labeled evidence, then quietly returned to him without comment. He never told anyone what he had heard in those final hours. Not even the medics who saved him. Some things, he decided, were better left buried. Recovery was not a straight line. It began in the surgical wing of a forward operating base where silence hung heavier than pain. Tubes fed into his arms, his chest, his neck. Machines breathed for him for 2 days. His eyes remained closed, and his skin carried the pallor of someone more ghost than man. There were moments, unconfirmed, undocumented, when the monitors flatlined, only to flicker back to life seconds later. No names were spoken in those first days, and no information was shared outside the inner circle. His identity was protected, classified under layers of restricted clearance. For official purposes, he was a non-event, a redacted entry in a report that would never be publicly released. But he lived. When consciousness returned, it did so gradually, first through sensation. Cold against skin, light behind the eyelids, the hum of electricity somewhere close, and then through pain. Every joint, every muscle, every breath reminded him of what had happened. His body had not survived the collapse intact. His right leg was shattered beyond functional repair. His lungs were scarred from days of breathing dust. He could not speak. For a week, his world was a blur of ceiling tiles and needle pricks, voices that never used names, and shadows that passed without leaving echoes. They kept the room dim. They kept the records handwritten. Nothing digital. Nothing traceable. Eventually, he was moved. Not to a hospital in Germany or a stateside VA facility, but to a secure rehabilitation unit without signage or a paper trail. There were no other patients, only handlers in civilian clothing and rotating doctors who referred to him only as the survivor. His progress was recorded, but never celebrated. There were no interviews, no medals, no press releases. He was given a cover identity and a set of documents outlining his non-combat injury sustained during training. The men who pulled him from the ground were reassigned and ordered to never speak of the operation. The technician who first received the signal was transferred and later discharged. Even the equipment used during his recovery was labeled experimental and decommissioned within months. The story was erased before it ever existed, but he remembered everything. Not just the pain, but the silence. The absolute stillness of the mountain closing around him. The weight of time when there was no time. The slow passage of death that never quite arrived. In the sterile quiet of his new life, he held onto that memory like a weapon. He refused therapy. He declined prosthetics. He spoke only when necessary. What little money he was awarded in his discharge settlement, he used to buy a house far from population centers. A cabin buried in the tree line of a northern state where cell signal dropped, and snowfall buried roads for weeks. He lived alone. No visitors, no phone, no television. Only the low hum of wind through pine and the occasional rustle of wildlife moving through the underbrush. Inside that cabin was a single shelf, nailed into concrete, supporting a small glass box. Inside the box rested the remains of the transmitter. The copper wire was bent, blackened from battery corrosion. The casing was cracked open, its internal board fused in places from makeshift soldering, and yet it still resembled the shape he had assembled in the dark. Once a year, on the exact date of his burial, he would remove it from the box and place it on a steel table. He would connect what remained of the coil to a makeshift shortwave receiver he built himself. No power grid, no internet. A sealed, analog system looped through a custom amplifier. He would sit in the dark and turn the dial until the static aligned just right, and then he would speak. The message was always the same, a string of code, a pulse tone, a whisper sent out into the void. Not because he believed someone would hear it, but because it reminded him that once, against everything, someone had. He transmitted for exactly 1 hour, then powered down the system and returned the transmitter to its case. He would not speak for the rest of the night. He would sit with the memory and allow the silence to stretch until morning. The nightmares never stopped. Some nights, he would wake up drenched in sweat, gasping as though the air had turned to stone. The walls of his cabin, though made of cedar and reinforced insulation, often felt like they were pressing inward. He no longer felt safe underground. He no longer slept without a knife beside his bed, but he survived. And that, he understood, came at a price. Every breath he drew was one borrowed from men who didn't make it. Every second above ground was a debt paid in silence. Over time, his name was forgotten. His story was buried beneath newer stories, louder stories, stories with footage and medals and headlines. No one asked questions about the sixth man. No one wondered how many signals had been missed before his had been heard. But in certain classified archives, inaccessible to most and encrypted to the point of invisibility, there remains a file. A set of audio recordings. A transmission log. A decoded fragment received by an obsolete listening post during a dead hour on a forgotten frequency. It reads simply, "Still here." And once a year, without fail, the system that recorded it powers itself on. Automatically. A residual script in a forgotten machine. It listens, just in case.